chapel at Wexford Hollow had been built to make small people feel smaller. And on the morning of her wedding, Emiline Carter stood beneath its high beams and understood exactly why. 200 candles. Virginia tidewater gentry packed shoulder to shoulder in the pews, their silks rustling like dry leaves, their fans moving in slow, judging arcs. The autumn light came down through the tall windows in long gold bars, and every one of them seemed to fall on her, as if the building itself had been told whose obedience was on sale today. At the front waited Nathaniel Hale. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, dressed in dark blue broadcloth that had cost more than her father's entire warehouse was now worth. He did not smile. Men like Nathaniel Hale did not smile at weddings. They presided over them. He watched her come up the aisle the way a creditor watches a debt walk through the door, with the calm certainty of a man collecting what is already his. Reverend Pelham opened the book. Emiline kept her chin level. She had learned that from her mother, who had spent 30 years learning to keep her chin level while a husband spoke over her at every table, signed away her dowry without a word, and buried her with a stone that bore only his name and the word wife. Emiline had stood at that grave 4 months ago. She had read that single word, wife, carved where a name should have been, and something inside her had gone very quiet and very hard. The Reverend's voice rolled out over the chapel, warm and practiced. The vows came. Nathaniel gave his without hesitation, to provide, to protect, to keep. His voice filled the room easily. He was a man accustomed to rooms filling when he spoke. Then the Reverend turned to her, and the words arrived that every woman in that chapel had spoken on her own wedding day. Do you, Emiline Carter, take this man to honor and to obey, to submit yourself wholly to his governance in all things before God and this company. The candles burned. The fans stopped moving. I will not say it. She had not raised her voice. That was the thing they would all remember afterward, when they told the story in parlors from the James River to the Rappahannock, that she had not shouted, had not wept, had not trembled. She had simply spoken, clear as a struck bell, into the most silent room in the colony. Reverend Pelham blinked. I beg your pardon, child. I will say honor. Emiline's gloved hands were folded before her, perfectly still. I will say cherish. I will say keep faith. I will not say obey, and I will not swear to submit myself wholly to any man's governance in all things. Not before God. God did not ask it of me. Only men do. The chapel came apart in a low roar, the gasp, the murmur, the scrape of 100 bodies leaning forward at once. Somewhere a woman said scandalous loud enough to carry. Emiline's father, 3 rows back, had gone the color of ash because he knew what she did not yet fully grasp, that the marriage settlement keeping his ruined house out of debtor's court was not yet signed, and that it sat at this very moment in Nathaniel Hale's strongbox, one stroke of a pen from salvation or stone. And Nathaniel Hale himself, he had not moved. But the color had risen up his throat, dark and slow, and his jaw had set like a man biting down on iron. 200 of the most powerful families in Tidewater, Virginia, were watching the richest landholder among them be refused at his own altar by a merchant's penniless daughter. Emiline saw the fury gather behind his eyes. She had expected it. She had braced for it the way one braces for a blow. What she had not expected was the other thing, buried far beneath the anger, so brief she almost missed it. Something that looked, for 1/2 of 1 second, like interest. Then we have a difficulty, Nathaniel Hale said quietly. His voice did not fill the room now. It dropped it into utter stillness, "Don't we, Miss Carter?" It was not a question. And Emiline, standing in the gold and the candlelight with her whole family's future folded inside a stranger's iron box, understood that whatever she had just set loose in this chapel, there was no longer any way to call it back. If you believe a woman should be more than a name on someone else's gravestone, stay with me, like this story, and follow Quiet Fires of America, where the quietest voices light the longest burning fires. She lifted her chin 1 degree higher and met his eyes and waited to see what kind of man she had just married. 6 months earlier, before the candles and the silence, Emiline Carter had been the happiest bankrupt girl in Norfolk. This was not as foolish as it sounds. The Carter warehouse on the waterfront still smelled of tobacco and tar and the Green River wind, and on good mornings, with the gulls wheeling over the masts and her father humming off-key over the daybooks, it had been easy to believe the ledgers would write themselves. Emiline had grown up in that warehouse, perched on a flour barrel with a slate in her lap, and somewhere between her 7th year and her 17th she had discovered a thing that delighted her endlessly. Numbers told the truth even when people would not. She was good with them. Better than good. Where her father saw a wall of figures and reached for his pipe, Emiline saw a story. This debt called due too early, that shipment insured for more than it carried, this captain who always rounded in his own favor by a half-penny on the pound. She caught a clerk skimming when she was 14. She caught a chandler double billing when she was 16. She did it laughing, more often than not, because to Emiline a hidden error was not a tragedy but a puzzle, and she had never in her life met a puzzle she did not want to open. "You see too much, girl," her father would say, half proud and half afraid. "A woman who counts that close makes men nervous." "Then they should keep cleaner books," she would answer, and steal a fig from his coat pocket, and he would laugh because he could not help it. But numbers, in the end, told their truth about the Carters too. The war that everyone in Tidewater now spoke of in low voices, the closed port of Boston, the angry committees, the king's ships riding at anchor like patient crows, had already begun to strangle the small merchant houses. 2 of her father's ships were held in a harbor that no longer cleared colonial cargo. A London creditor, sensing weakness across the water, called in notes years before their term. By the spring of 1774, the Carter house was not failing slowly. It was failing, and the only question left was whether it would land in debtor's court and take her father's freedom with it. Emiline knew the exact figure. She had run it 3 times by candle. They were short by 1,100 pounds sterling, and there was not 1,100 pence to be found honestly in the whole of their accounts. That was when Nathaniel Hale's name first crossed their threshold. He held the largest tobacco estate above the James. Wexford Hollow, 4,000 acres, a great house of brick, and a reputation as a man who never lost a negotiation because he never entered one he had not already won. He had buried a wife 2 years prior. He needed no money and no merchant's daughter. What he wanted, his agent explained over Carter's worn parlor table, was simpler and colder than that. A young, healthy, respectable wife who would manage his household, sit at the head of his table, and ask no questions about the running of his affairs. In exchange, the Carter debts would be quietly absorbed, the warehouse saved, her father kept out of the cells. A fair settlement, the agent had said, sliding the papers across. Her father had wept that night, in the dark, thinking she could not hear. And Emiline, bright, laughing Emiline, who had never met a puzzle she would not open, had sat at the top of the stairs with her arms around her knees and understood that this was the one puzzle she was not permitted to solve, only to surrender to. She had gone to her mother's grave the next morning. She had stood before that single carved word, wife, in the cold churchyard light, and she had not wept. She had made a promise instead, quietly, the way she did everything that mattered. I will save them. I will marry your gravedigger if I must, but I will not be buried the way you were buried. I will keep my name. I will keep my voice, whatever it costs. She had not known, standing there, what it would cost. She had not yet read the marriage settlement closely, had not yet seen the single clause, buried in the 4th paragraph in a clerk's cramped hand, that would have signed away far more than her obedience. She would find it 3 nights before the wedding, by candlelight, with her heart going cold and hard all over again. And that was the night she decided what she would say at the altar, and what she would not. The wedding did not end. That was the strange thing. After the words, "We have a difficulty," after the chapel boiled and the reverend stammered and Emiline's father looked one breath from collapse, Nathaniel Hale did the last thing 200 witnesses expected. He turned to Pelham and said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, "Strike the word. Honor will serve. Continue." And the reverend, who had never in 40 years amended a vow at an altar, looked into the landholder's face and continued. They were married on her terms by noon. By evening, the carriages had rolled away down the Wexford Road, carrying the scandal with them to every parlor in the Tidewater and Emiline Hale. For she would keep that much, the name attached to the bargain. Sat across a vast dining table from a husband she did not know, in a house she did not trust, having won something she did not yet understand. He let the silence run a long while. Testing her, she thought. She let it run right back. "You humiliated me," he said at last. "You meant to own me," she answered. "I thought it fair to correct the misunderstanding before witnesses, so neither of us could pretend later." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The memory of where one might go. "My first wife," he said, "never once contradicted me, in 9 years. And was she happy?" The question landed somewhere he had not guarded. He set down his glass. "No," he said slowly, "I don't believe she was." "Then we have already learned more than you learned in 9 years, Emiline said, "and we have been married since noon." He looked at her then. Really looked, the way she looked at a column of figures that would not add, with the dawning irritation of a careful man who has found something that does not behave as it should. And Emiline, who had spent her life watching men decide what she was, watched him fail to decide, and felt the first small thrill of the puzzle opening. In the weeks that followed, they did not fall in love. Emiline would have distrusted it if they had. What happened was slower and far more dangerous to a guarded man. They began to negotiate. He gave her the household, expecting her to fail at it. Instead, she had Wexford Hollow's accounts laid before her within a fortnight, and in 3 days found that the kitchen steward had been selling the estate's surplus flour in Williamsburg and pocketing the difference. She did not rage. She simply set the corrected figures before Nathaniel at supper, quietly, the way one returns a borrowed thing. "You've dismissed him?" he asked, reading. "I've kept him," she said. "A thief who knows he is watched works harder than an honest man who is not. I've only adjusted his wages to match what he was already taking. He'll think me generous." Nathaniel set the paper down and regarded his wife across the candlelight for a long, long moment. "My agents," he said, "have managed those books for 11 years. "Yes," said Emiline gently. "I noticed." It was after that night that he began to come to the study where she worked. At first to oversee, then to ask. Then, though neither of them named it, simply to sit in the lamplight while she worked, a glass of Madeira untouched at his elbow, the great hard machine of his caution slowly, grudgingly, learning to rest in the presence of a woman who told him the truth. She found him difficult and proud and lonely in a way he would have died before admitting. he found her. She could see him finding it, day by day, against his every intention. Interesting. It was not yet warmth, but it was the place warmth grows from, and they were both, in their separate, careful ways, watching it happen and saying nothing, which was why neither of them, in those first soft weeks, paid close enough attention to the cousin. Silas Hale arrived from Richmond on a gray morning in the 4th week, all easy charm and morning black, still worn 2 years after a death that had nothing to do with him. He was Nathaniel's late father's brother's son, a man of good name and empty purse. And he came, he said, only to pay his respects to the new mistress of Wexford Hollow and to offer his poor help with the estate's burdens in these uncertain times. He kissed Emiline's hand and called her cousin and praised the household, and his eyes the whole while moved over the rooms, the silver, the land beyond the windows, with the slow tenderness of a man pricing what he intends to inherit. That night, putting away the day's ledgers, Emiline reached for the bound book of standing debts. The record of every note Wexford Hollow owed and was owed, and found one entry that did not sit right. A loan against the Southfields, dated the spring before Nathaniel's first wife died. The hand was correct. The seal was correct. But the figure had been altered. She was certain of it. £1,100, where the careful original strokes beneath suggested it had once read 100. £1,100. The exact sum, she thought with a slow chill, that had once stood between her own father and the debtor's cells. She closed the book. She did not yet know what it meant. But she had never in her life met a puzzle she did not want to open. And somewhere in the great dark house, she heard Silas Hale's easy laughter drift up the stairs. Emiline did not sleep that night, and by the gray before dawn she had taught herself a new and unwelcome truth. A forged number is the loneliest thing in the world, because until you can prove it, you are the only person who believes it exists. She began the way she always began, quietly, laughing where anyone could see, so that no one would think to watch her hands. By day, she was the new mistress of Wexford Hollow, charming Silas over breakfast, teasing Nathaniel out of his silences, ordering the autumn preserves. By night, she sat with the standing debt book and a single candle and took the Southfield loan apart figure by figure. The seal was genuine. That was what frightened her most. Someone had not forged a false document. Someone had altered a true one. Taken a real loan of £100 made years ago against a corner of land, and patiently, expertly, thickened the strokes until 100 became 1,100. The interest had been compounding on the false sum ever since, and the note was held, she discovered when she traced the endorsements down the page, by a Richmond lending house in which one quiet partner held the controlling interest. The partner's name was not written, but the hand that had endorsed the transfer was a hand she had been watching pour coffee for a fortnight. Silas. She understood the shape of it then, all at once, the way a column of figures finally drops into true. Silas Hale could not inherit Wexford Hollow while Nathaniel lived and held it clear of debt, but a man buried under enough quiet obligation could be forced to sell. A field, then a wing, then the whole. And a patient cousin with a controlling share in the right lending house could stand ready to buy the bones of an estate for pennies, all of it legal, all of it sealed, all of it slow enough that no one would ever cry theft. It was, Emiline thought, with something close to professional respect, a beautiful piece of work. She had caught clerks skimming half pennies. This was a man who meant to swallow 4,000 acres one signature at a time, and he had been doing it, she now suspected, since before the first wife was cold. She made one mistake. She let him see her looking. It was nothing. A glance held a half-second too long across the breakfast table when Silas mentioned, lightly, that the South Fields were poor land and Nathaniel would be wise to let them go. But Silas Hale had not survived 2 years of patient theft by missing the moment a clever woman went still. She felt his attention turn on her like a draft under a door, and she understood, too late, that she had announced herself to the one person in the house she should have let underestimate her. The blow came within the week, and it was elegant. A man rode out from Richmond, a lawyer, courteous, regretful, bearing notice that the Southfield note had been called due in full, £1,100, with 3 years compounded interest, payable within the quarter, or the lending house would move to seize not merely the Southfields, but, by a cross-default clause buried in the original instrument, any Wexford property pledged against Hale credit, which Emiline already knew was nearly all of it. Nathaniel read the notice in his study with his face like winter. "This is impossible," he said. "I borrowed 100 against that land." 100. "I remember the morning." "I know," Emiline said quietly. "I can see where the figure was changed." He looked up sharply. "Changed? The strokes are thickened. The seal is true, but the sum is false. Someone altered a genuine note and let the interest do the rest." She drew breath. "Nathaniel, the endorsement transferring it to the Richmond house is in Silas's hand." For a moment, she thought he would refuse it. She watched the old machine of his pride try to reject the idea that a man of his own blood, eating at his own table, had been quietly digging beneath his house for years. She braced for him to defend the cousin, to dismiss her, to become every husband she had feared at her mother's grave. He did not. He came around the desk and stood before her, and the winter in his face had turned to something harder and warmer at once. "You found this," he said. "You. In a fortnight, while my agents and my lawyers and I myself sat blind for years." "You weren't blind," she said. "You were busy being certain. It's the one thing a careful man can't afford, and the one thing he never knows he's spending." Something broke open in him then. Not love, not yet, but the thing beneath love, which is trust given against a lifetime's training not to give it. He took her hand. He had never once taken her hand. "Then we are in a great deal of trouble," Nathaniel Hale said, "and I find I would rather be in it with you than safe with anyone else. Tell me what you see, Emiline. All of it. I am done being certain." And Emiline, who had married to save her father and sworn only to keep her name and voice, felt the floor of her own heart shift beneath her and knew with a quiet, dangerous clarity that she had begun, against all her careful arithmetic, to fall in love with her husband at the exact moment they stood to lose everything. She held his hand. She did not let it go. "Then here is the first thing I see," she said. "The note can only be proven false by the man who altered it, or by the original lender who lent the true 100. Silas will have made certain that man cannot be found." She felt the puzzle open in her mind, vast and dark and finally whole. "So we are going to find him anyway. And until we do, my love, we are going to let your cousin believe he has already won." They had 1 quarter. 90 days to disprove a sum that 3 years of compounding interest had made to look like gospel, against a man who had spent those same 3 years making certain no proof survived. Emiline began, as she always did, with the thing everyone else had stopped looking at. "The original lender," she said, the morning after Nathaniel took her hand. They sat together over the standing debt book, no longer husband overseeing wife, but two people bent over the same dark column. £100, true coin, lent against the Southfields the spring before your first wife died. Who lent it? Nathaniel frowned into memory. A man named Aldous Finch, a small lender out of Williamsburg. Decent, careful. His jaw tightened. He died. 2 winters passed. A fever, they said. They said. Emiline let the 2 words sit. And when a careful man dies, what becomes of his careful books? It was the first thread, and she pulled it the way she pulled all threads, patiently, sideways, laughing where anyone could see. She wrote to Williamsburg under the pretext of settling an old household account. She learned that Aldous Finch had left a widow, that the widow had sold his papers to satisfy his own small debts, and that the papers had been bought, quietly, for more than they were worth, by an agent acting for a Richmond house, the same house that now held the Southfield note. Silas had bought the evidence and burned it. Of course he had. Emiline had expected nothing less, and felt the cold admiration sharpen in her again. But she had learned something at 14, catching her first thief, a thing that had never once failed her. A man who covers his tracks tells you exactly where he has walked. Silas had reached all the way to Williamsburg to buy a dead man's books. That meant the dead man's books had mattered. That meant somewhere in them had been the one true number that unmade the lie. And careful men, Emiline knew, almost never kept only one copy of anything that matters. Finch was decent and careful, she told Nathaniel that night. A careful lender records every loan twice, once in his own ledger, and once with the county clerk who registers the lien against the land. Silas bought the private ledger. But a lien on land is filed with the court. You cannot buy that and burn it. It is the colony's own memory. Nathaniel stared at her. Then it is simply there, in Williamsburg. All this time. It is simply there, she agreed, which is why we must not seem to want it. This was the part she did not teach him, because it could not be taught. The long patience, the willingness to let an enemy believe he is winning right up until the floor opens beneath him. Over the following weeks, Emiline played the part Silas most wanted to see. She let him watch her grow anxious. She let him overhear her urging Nathaniel to sell the Southfields and be done with the ruinous note. She let Silas press his help upon them, and press he did, gliding through the house with his easy morning black charm, offering to intercede with the Richmond house, offering to find a buyer for the fields, the spider drawing the web tighter while the flies, he believed, only struggled. He even, once, caught her weeping in the long gallery. She had arranged to be caught. The tears were real enough. She had thought of her mother's gravestone to summon them, and hated him a little more for making her spend that grief on his deception. "Cousin," Silas murmured, all tenderness, "you must not distress yourself. Estates rise and fall. A clever woman thinks of her own security. Were anything to befall Nathaniel's fortunes, I would see you provided for. You need only have a friend in the family." And there it was. The offer beneath the offer, the true shape of him laid bare for one instant. He would take the estate, and he would keep her too, the bright, clever ornament, grateful and dependent and silenced at last. Emiline lowered her wet eyes so he would not see what was in them. "You are too good, cousin," she said. Inside, the last of her hesitation burned away. She had wondered, in honest moments, whether she was being merely vengeful. She was not. She was being correct. The journey to Williamsburg was made under cover of a different errand. A visit to a milliner, a wife's harmless vanity, nothing a watching cousin need fear. Nathaniel did not come. His absence from home would have rung every bell in Silas's head. Emiline went with only her old nurse for company, and a letter of introduction she had written herself in her husband's hand, with his blessing, to the county clerk. The clerk was a tired man in a cold office stacked with the colony's paper memory. He did not want to search 3 years back for a lien on poor land. Emiline made him want to. Not with bribery, which leaves a trail, but with the one thing that has moved tired clerks since records began. She was kind to him and interested in his work, and she let him be, for one afternoon, a man whose careful filing mattered to someone. He found it at dusk. The Finch lien, registered in the county's own bound book, in the colony's own ink, beyond the reach of any Richmond gold. 100 pounds, lent to N. Hale against the south parcel of Wexford Hollow. 100. Recorded in the spring before a wife died, sealed by a clerk who had no reason on earth to lie, sitting untouched in a public book while 3 streets away a forged copy of the same loan threatened to swallow 4,000 acres. Emiline sat very still in the cold office, looking at the true number, and found that her hands were trembling, not with triumph, but with the nearness of it. A fortnight later, and Nathaniel might have sold the fields. A year of certainty more, and the whole estate would have gone, signature by signature, into a patient cousin's hands, and no one would ever have called it anything but misfortune. She had the clerk make a certified copy, sealed and witnessed under the court's own authority. She thanked him as though he had given her a kingdom, which in a way he had. And she rode home through the autumn dark with the true number against her heart and the whole shape of the reckoning forming clear and cold and complete in her mind. But a certified figure was not yet enough. She knew it before Nathaniel said it, when she laid the copy before him by candlelight and watched the fierce hope leap in his face. "This proves the sum was 100, he said. "This unmakes the debt." "It unmakes the debt," Emiline agreed. "But it does not hang Silas." She pressed her palm flat over the parchment. "A false sum could be a clerk's error, a misread stroke. He will say so. He will pay a small forfeit, weep for the misunderstanding, and remain in this house, at this table, with his name unstained. And the next time he moves against us, he will not be careless enough to leave the lien standing." Her voice dropped. "I do not want only the fields back, Nathaniel. I want him finished. For your first wife, who I begin to think did not die of any natural fever. From my father. For your house. To finish him, a forged figure is not enough. I need the hand that forged it to be named by someone the court cannot dismiss." "Finch is dead," Nathaniel said quietly. "Finch is dead." Emiline looked into the candle. But a careful lender does not work alone. He has a clerk who copies his notes. A man who held the pen beside him for years and saw whose seal went on what. She had been turning it over the whole ride home, and now she said the thing that frightened her, because it was the only road left. Silas bought Finch's papers from the widow. To do that, he had to deal with whoever kept those papers after Finch died. There was a clerk, Nathaniel, and if that clerk is alive, if Silas was careless enough to leave a living man who watched him buy a dead one's silence, she did not finish. She did not need to. Somewhere in the colony, perhaps, there was one frightened man who knew the whole truth and had every reason in the world to keep it buried. And Emiline Hale, who had never in her life met a puzzle she would not open, now had 90 dwindling days to find him, and to make him brave enough to speak before them all. The clerk's name was Josiah Pry, and he did not want to be found. It took Emiline 3 weeks and the last of her 90 days to find him, and she found him not through cleverness, but through the thing Silas had never thought to guard. Fear leaves a smell, and frightened men run in patterns. A lender's clerk who suddenly leaves Williamsburg, takes no new post, and lives quietly above a co-op's shop in Yorktown on money he cannot account for, is not a man who has prospered. He is a man who has been paid to vanish, and is waiting every day for the second kind of payment that such men eventually receive. She went to him alone. She did not threaten. She had learned, catching thieves since 14, that a cornered man defends himself, but a seen man sometimes breaks. "Mr. Pry," she said, in the dim room above the co-op's shop, "I know that Aldous Finch lent £100 against the south fields of Wexford Hollow. I know the note was altered to read 1100 after he died. I know Silas Hale bought Finch's papers from the widow to bury it. And I know that you held the pen beside Finch for 9 years, which means you know his true hand better than any man alive, and that you watched what was done to it." She let the silence work. "I am not here to ruin you. You are already ruined. Silas has paid you to disappear, and you know as well as I do what happens to the witness once the estate is his and the danger is past. A man who buys silence does not leave it breathing forever." Josiah Pry's hands shook around his cup. "He'll kill me," he whispered. "If I speak, he'll—" "He cannot kill what the whole county has already heard," Emiline said gently. "Your safety is not in silence, Mr. Pry. It never was. Your safety is in speaking so loudly, before so many, that your death would point straight at the only man it could profit. I am offering you the one thing Silas never will." She leaned forward. "I am offering to make you impossible to bury." He wept, and then he told her everything. How Silas had come to him after Finch's fever. How the alteration had been done with Finch's own ink and Finch's own seal lifted from the dead man's desk. How Silas had spoken, drunk and proud one night, of how the first Mrs. Hale had grown curious about that same Southfield note in the weeks before her fever took her. Emiline went very cold at that. She had suspected it. Hearing it was another thing entirely. The reckoning came on quarter day, in the great hall of the Williamsburg Merchants' Court, where the Richmond lending house had convened before magistrate and assembled gentry to enforce the seizure of Wexford Hollow. Silas had made certain of the audience. He had wanted witnesses to Nathaniel's ruin, the better to seem the gracious cousin who would, in time, rescue the family lands. Half the tidewater had come. The same silks, the same slow fans, many of the same faces that had watched a bride refuse a vow in a candlelit chapel half a year before. They expected to watch a proud man fall. Silas rose first, all sorrow and reason, and laid out the note. £1,100, sealed, endorsed, 3 years compounding, regrettably past saving. The magistrate examined the seal and found it true. A murmur of sympathy moved through the hall. Nathaniel Hale, it seemed, was finished, and his strange, unmanageable wife with him. Then Emiline asked leave to speak. The magistrate hesitated. A wife, addressing the court. But Nathaniel said, clear and certain so the whole hall heard it, "My wife speaks with my full voice and better sense than mine. Let her be heard." And Emiline saw, in the faces of the watching women, something flicker that had not been there at her wedding. Not scandal now, but attention. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. "The seal is true," she agreed, and let them lean in. "I will save the court the trouble of doubting it." Aldous Finch sealed this note himself, the spring before he died. But he sealed it for £100. She laid the certified lien upon the table, sealed under the county's own authority, registered with this colony's own clerk, in this colony's own book, the same week, against the same land. £100. A sum no Richmond gold can reach into a public record and change. The magistrate read it. The hall began to stir. "A clerk's error," Silas said smoothly, but the smoothness had a crack in it now. A misread figure. These things. It was no error. Emiline said. It was a careful man's true record, and the alteration of his private note was no error either. It was done after his death, with his own seal, by a man who then bought his papers from his widow to bury the proof. She turned, for the first time, and looked directly at Silas Hale across the crowded hall. Was it not? Cousin, you cannot prove a hand, Silas said. His voice had risen. You have a number in a book. A number proves nothing of who. Then let the man who held the pen tell us whose hand it was. And Josiah Pry walked into the great hall. Emiline watched it happen. Watched the color go out of Silas Hale's face the way it had once gone dark up Nathaniel's throat at an altar. Watched the careful, patient, 3 years' work of a brilliant and merciless man collapse in the space of a single breath, because the one thing his certainty had never accounted for was that the frightened could be made brave. Pry's voice shook, but he told the court he had watched Silas Hale alter a dead man's note with a dead man's seal. He told them Silas had paid him to vanish. And then, into the gathering roar of the hall, he told them the thing Emiline had hoped never to need and had brought him there to say. That Silas had boasted the first misses. Hale grew curious about that very note in the weeks before a fever no physician could explain took her from a healthy bed. The hall came apart as the chapel had come apart 6 months before. The same gasp, the same scrape of bodies, the same word scandalous. But it was not Emiline they turned to stare at now. Silas Hale ran for the door. He did not reach it. 2 magistrates' men and a colony's worth of witnesses stood between him and any road out of what he had done, and the law that he had used so patiently as a blade closed over him at last like deep water. Emiline did not watch him taken. She had no taste for it. The puzzle was solved, and the solving had never been about the pleasure of his fall. She turned instead to her husband, who stood looking at her across the ruin of his cousin's scheme with an expression she had never seen on the face of any man. Not ownership, not even pride, but something stunned and humbled and wholly undefended. "You gave me your voice," she said quietly, "only for him. I only used it well." "No," Nathaniel said. He took both her hands now, before them all, before the whole watching tidewater, the richest landholder above the James holding the hands of the merchant's daughter who had refused to obey him. "You had your own. I was only fortunate enough, at last, to listen." The winter that followed was the first true winter of their marriage, and Emiline would remember it, in the long years after, as the season the house finally exhaled. Silas Hale was tried at Williamsburg before the spring thaw. The forged note, the certified lien, the testimony of Josiah Pry, who lived, loudly and safely, exactly as Emiline had promised he would, left the magistrates no room for mercy and no appetite for it. The matter of the first Mrs. Hale could never be fully proven. The dead kept their own counsel, and a fever leaves no seal to lift. But the colony drew its own conclusions, and they followed Silas into his cell and stayed with him there, which was a kind of justice Emiline found she could live beside. The Southfield note was struck down to its true £100. Wexford Hollow stood whole, 4,000 acres that had nearly gone, signature by patient signature, into a murderer's hands remained under the names of the 2 people who had fought to keep them. Her father's debts had long since been quietly absorbed, the warehouse saved, the threat of the cells gone. He came to Wexford Hollow at Christmas, an old man grown suddenly younger, and stood in the great hall where his daughter now sat at the head of her own table and wept again. But differently this time, in the daylight, where she could see. "Your mother," he began, and could not finish. "I know," Emiline said, and held him. "I kept the promise. for both of us. She had not, in truth, expected to keep the other thing. The bargain she had never quite let herself name. She had married to save her family and sworn only to keep her name and her voice, and she had braced her whole heart against the day a husband would try to take them. She had never braced against this. A man who, having tried at the first to own her, had learned instead to need her. And then, somewhere in the long lamplit nights over a dark column of figures, to love her. Not despite the refusal at the altar, but because of it. For it was the refusal, Nathaniel told her once, deep in that first true winter, that had saved them both. Had you said the word, he said, had you obeyed me as my first wife obeyed me, I would have gone on being certain. I would have sold the South Fields when Silas advised it. I would have lost my house and my honor and my life to a smiling man and called him family to the end. He turned her hand over in his, studying it as he had once studied his ledgers, as though it held a sum he could not believe had come out in his favor. You refuse to be governed by me, Emiline. And it is the only reason I am not, this winter, a ruined man in a borrowed grave. I refuse to be erased, she said. The governing, I find, we manage tolerably well between us. He laughed. He laughed easily now, a thing the man at the altar had not known how to do. And the sound of it filled the great hall in a way his commanding had never managed to. They did not become a gentle couple. Emiline would have distrusted it if they had. They argued the estate's affairs across the supper table with a heat that scandalized visiting matrons. She overruled him on the matter of the western timber and was proven right within the year. He overruled her on the milling contract and was proven right within 2, and each took an unbecoming pleasure in the other's rare defeats. The tidewater never quite knew what to make of them. The landholder who consulted his wife on every note and lien, the wife who kept her own ledgers and her own opinions and, scandal of scandals, her own name signed beside his on the estate's accounts. But the tidewater watched, too, and in the parlors where they had once whispered scandalous over a bride who would not obey, a different thing began, slowly, to be said. That Wexford Hollow had never been so well run, nor its master so little a fool, since the difficult Carter girl came to sit at the head of his table and refuse him to his face, on the anniversary of the wedding. A year to the day from the candlelit chapel and the silence and the vow she would not say. Nathaniel found her in the study where it had all begun, bent over the standing debt book by a single candle, exactly as he had first found her a lifetime ago. You needn't watch those figures so closely anymore, he said from the doorway. There is no one left to cheat us. Emiline looked up, and in the candlelight she was not the frightened girl at her mother's grave, nor the cold bride at the altar, but something the year had made of her. A woman entirely in possession of her own life, bright and unbowed and unafraid. There is always someone, eventually, she said, and smiled. But that is not why I watch them. She closed the book. I watch them because numbers tell the truth even when people will not. It is how I knew, in the end, that you had begun to tell me the truth. Your accounts changed, Nathaniel, the night you stopped being certain. I saw it before you said a word. He crossed the room and stood behind her chair and rested his hands on her shoulders, and for a while neither of them spoke at all. She had come to Wexford Hollow to save her father and keep her voice, expecting nothing, hoping for less. She had refused, before God and the gathered gentry, to vanish into another woman's grave. And in refusing to be owned, she had found the one thing she had never thought to bargain for, and could never have been given, only built. Slowly, over a long year, by candlelight, with her own clear voice and her own steady hands, a marriage of equals, freely chosen, in a house she had helped to save, beside a man who had finally learned to listen. Her mother's stone, she had heard, was to be recut that spring. Emiline had ordered it herself and paid for it from her own accounts and chosen the words. It would no longer read only wife. It would bear her mother's name.